Let's start off with the idea of, Chinese medicine or Eastern medicine, because I think that's probably the most common around in Halifax anyway, that, people are like, I'm alternative, I do this and this and this, and how does that kind of, this, with craniosacral therapy, it's a lot of people still look at it as an alternative, and how do you feel like they connect?
Yeah, this is pretty cool because I think one of the things is that people don't necessarily have always an accurate view of what Eastern medicine, traditional China, I tend to speak of it primarily as Chinese medicine, but I know I personally do a lot with some Japanese ideas as well, that it is different from the way that people conceive it is. So there's a couple of things about it. One is that, I mean, again, particularly if you're talking about China, it has, there's sort of an idea, actually this is covered in one of the books I have by a guy called Wang Q Kit. There's sort of this idea because there's a kind of a flowery translation of Chinese medicine concepts when they're put into English, fountain of such and such, or three wise men, that it is a kind of a mystical system. Whereas the reality is that those descriptive terms are just simply the language describing what they're actually seeing happening in a body or a physical system. So Chinese medicine in particular, just kind of through an accident of history, of a lot of other cultures, first of all, didn't write down the things that people were discovering about healing. And second of all, didn't actually keep the writings. What happened in China was that there was this huge body of information that people were saying, okay, when when you're doing acupuncture and you poke this particular spot, what happens? And so in some ways it's the greatest empirical tradition in the world, is what's in Chinese medicine. Because, people think about scientists and they think about, okay, well, we're empiricists and people in the East are not. That's after all part of the whole East-West dichotomy. They miss the fact that there are thousands of years of people saying, what happens when I poke here? What does that do? Which is exactly an empirical tradition. So, and then it was all written down, it was all reviewed, it was, people would periodically go through the whole body of acupuncture literature, and they would say, okay, well, this doesn't seem to be true anymore, this is old ideas of it. Some of those same things, again, that you think of about science, of the review of the information to see whether it's current, to see whether it's still fitting with the theories that you have about how things work. So that's actually an incredibly important aspect of it. And one of the things that was done through that very old empirical tradition was an understanding of diagnosis through some of these very subtle sort of things. I mean, the classic thing that you see is somebody doing pulse work, and they feel your pulse, and somehow they get all of this magical information, and you can't really be getting that information just from a pulse. But the reality is that the reason Chinese diagnosis is based the way it is because if you're sensitive to different qualities, you can pick up that kind of information. Now, I don't actually have a background in Chinese diagnostics, and because my work isn't primarily diagnostic in general, I'm not going to say, oh, you have such and such and such and such going on with you. I'm going to let your body tell me what it needs to do at a particular time. But I do have enough of a background in it to know that the kinds of subtlety of information that you're picking up from the body that you can be trained to find can be very, very important with your understanding of what's actually happening in particular areas in the tissue and that kind of stuff. And also knowing that whole field out there exists of, we can look at your tongue, and it does sort of really emphasize how important some of these very subtle things are that you perceive maybe, or I perceive maybe in a more intuitive and holistic way. Another sort of relationship with Asian medicine, and this is a bit more Asian than Chinese, and specifically is Japanese acupuncture, which I, again, approached first from the perspective of a client. And one of the things about Japanese acupuncture that differs from Chinese acupuncture is that it was actually first practiced primarily by blind practitioners. And how can a blind practitioner figure out where to put a needle? And the answer is they can figure it out because they can feel it. And so that ability to feel on a very, very sharp sort of level, specifically where, you know, some of those nodal points are, those points where you can get massive change from relatively small input, you know, is something that you see some of these Japanese practitioners doing. And they would be, you also sort of have that emphasis on subtlety and elegance, and Japanese practitioners tend to use even the finest needles, and you know, sometimes they won't even insert, and but yet they can get these significant effects. And, you know, for me personally, that actually worked really well because I needed a very, very subtle hand, and so it was great to sort of, you know, come to that understanding about subtlety and elegance and doing just the right thing in just the right place. So, so one of the other very, very important ideas that shows up a lot in Chinese medicine and Eastern medicine in general is this idea of qi. And qi is one of those things that's very hard to explain to other people. I think I may have explained some of it. Otherwise, it could be bioelectrics. It could be, I mean, pretty much every single acupuncture point has some kind of biological significance, you know, that it's where you might have neural pathways crossing, or that it affects the way that lymph is produced, or all of these other kinds of things. But qi is this kind of conception of an actual stuff, an invisible, subtle stuff that is a part of your life force and, you know, moves sort of with relation to you. And again, somewhere I came across this idea, and I don't know this for sure, but that most other medical systems other than Western medicine have this idea of the life force. And I mean, it actually even used to be in Western thought a lot more than it was, where you had you know, Galvani, who was talking about animal magnetism, and, you know, again, that sort of, that there's something about being alive which makes you different than not being alive. And qi is that kind of idea. And, you know, if you come from a society where instead of saying, does qi exist or does it not exist, you sort of are in the place where you're assuming it exists, and then you try to write down how it behaves, you can come up with some of these things that you might see in acupuncture. And it's not like it's all mystical and magical, it's just coming from a perspective where this whole sort of thing exists that doesn't exist in a Western paradigm. And in my work, you know, there is very little question that it's a lot easier to do the work I do if you have that concept of qi than if you don't. It just works better. And so, because there are so many different sort of ways of discussing that idea, I think in Hinduism it's called prana, you know, and it's a little bit different than the Jewish ruach, but it's sort of a similar kind of idea. For me, qi just expresses it best, so that's why I use that particular term. And also, the ki part of Reiki is the same word, it's qi. And Reiki is a little bit different. It talks about using universal life force energy, which is not just the qi that's within you, but qi that's related to, you know, sort of life force outside of you as well. Okay. Is there anything else about... Oh yes, sorry, one more thing about Eastern medicine. I think... Where was it? Oh, very important. The other thing, as I say, that is really important about the relationship of Eastern medicine to some of this stuff is kind of this concept of stillness and the empowerment of stillness, as opposed to a standard massage therapy session where people are kind of moving. We tend to keep much more still, and the more advanced you get, the stiller you get. And what happens is that you're sort of entering this very specific mindset state where you know, you're just neutral and you're just there and you're just sort of allowing whatever it is to happen. You know, I think that might be considered a Zen state. I don't know. Specifically, I don't know enough about Zen. But it's a very, it's like a way of doing nothing in the most perfect way possible. And that, you know, in some ways the best possible practitioner is one who does nothing most effectively. Which sounds odd. You know, it sounds odd to sort of have that value on really keeping still and, you know, just so that you can hear what's happening, you can feel what's happening. And it just occurs without you necessarily being part of it.